So this is the third video in the current series that I am making, which is all about magic systems. My last two videos were about hard and soft magic systems, and in both of those I sort of alluded to this secondary axis that splices the hard and soft magic system spectrum, and that is the rational versus irrational axes. So once again, this is not really an idea completely original to me. It's also not from Brandon's blog post. It's from a blog post I read from the Mythcreants about how to create a rational magic system, and it got me thinking about if a rational magic system was necessarily the same thing as a hard magic system. And in the end, I sort of decided that it wasn't. My definition of a rational magic system is one in which the reader can begin to extrapolate the rules of a magic system once some of the initial rules are laid out. That being that the magic system follows some sort of logical, cohesive set of rules. An irrational magic system is obviously just the opposite. It's a magic system that may or may not follow a set of rules, but it is hard or impossible for the reader to pretty much figure out what those rules are going to be before the author gives it to them. So the reason that I believe rational magic systems are not the same as a hard magic system is because there are examples of rational magic systems that are both hard and soft, and irrational magic systems that are hard and soft. Not to mention, if you assume that they're the same, then you would assume that magic systems that are 50-50 versus hard and soft, like Harry Potter, are also partially rational and partially irrational, which they aren't always. Now, to be fair, many hard magic systems are also rational. This is because many people who are proponents of hard magic systems are also unknowingly proponents of a rational magic system. Brandon Sanderson, bringing him up again because he's the perfect example for magic systems, is a hard magic system writer and also a rational magic system writer. To go back to the Mistborn example, Mistborn is a hard magic system, as I discussed, but it's also incredibly rational. Once you understand that one metal, iron, has properties that you can burn, and an alloy of that metal, iron, in this example, has properties that can burn, you can kind of guess that there are going to be other metals that you can burn, and their counterpoint metal is going to be an alloy of that metal. You can start to figure this out as the rules are given to you. There's a trend and a pattern to the magic system. The magic in Mistborn is not random, and it doesn't feel random. They make sense for the magic that Brandon created. An example of an irrational but hard magic system would be Spider-Man, or pretty much any superhero in the Marvel franchise. They are irrational because although you understand the limitations of Spider-Man's abilities, you have no way of guessing what other abilities other people would have. So although you understand how Peter's magic works, how his superpowers work, you are not able to guess what the Green Goblin's powers are just because you understand Peter's. They are random from that aspect, and this is true of most of the characters in Spider-Man. Just because you know one character's powers and how they work does not mean you're going to be able to guess whatsoever what the powers of other people is going to be. And this is true for most of Marvel. Just because you've met, Tony Stark, Iron Man, in the Iron Man films doesn't mean that when you meet Cap, Steve Rogers, any idea how Cap's powers work. So this is really the primary difference between a rational and an irrational magic system. In one, your readers are more likely to guess where your magic system's going and how it's going to work as a whole, versus an irrational, it's really hard for them to guess. Both can work depending on what you're trying to write. It's just really what you want. Do you want your readers to be able to figure out how magic works before you get there or not? Having an irrational or an irrational magic system will dictate how you world build, how you establish a magic system for your readers. In a rational magic system, you usually don't have to give all the rules for your magic because your readers can logically make jumps to understand how the magic system works without you thoroughly explaining everything. So if you want your readers to be able to figure it out on their own and save yourself some word count and not have to explain every nuance of your work, a rational magic system might be what you want. But you also might want them to not be able to guess what's happening for the sake of plot twists. J.K. Rowling uses this incredibly effective in her works. She tends to introduce a new magic item that you wouldn't have been able to figure out before at the beginning of a book, and then there's a payoff at the end. So, for example, in the last book, in Deathly Hallows, you do not know what the Deathly Hallows are going into the book, and she doesn't want you to. The Deathly Hallows are a really big plot twist and reveal for Dumbledore's character. And so she doesn't want you to know that they exist until she tells you that they do. For her, a more illogical, again, it's sort of a spectrum. There are some things that make sense logically as far as Harry Potter goes, but plenty of it you couldn't guess is a thing until she tells you. Portkeys, most spells, you really can't guess until she tells you that they exist. And to great effect. The plot twist for Dumbledore, most people didn't see coming. Most people don't see the plot twist coming at the end of Goblet of Fire either, where the goblet is a portkey. She introduced a new magical object at the beginning of a book, and then used that same magical property object thing at the end for the climax. By doing this, she adds a lot of mystery and whimsy to her work. It's really well done, really well executed. But it may not be what's best for everybody. So I have examples for rational and irrational hard magic systems, obviously, and one for an irrational sort of midway. Are there rational and irrational soft magic systems? Well, obviously, that's kind of the point of the video. Now, soft and irrational seem to go hand in hand, and most soft magic systems that I've read are also, to a degree, irrational. You can't really figure out the rules before they come because you're not really given much of a basis for those rules. So it's kind of hard for you to extrapolate. So that being said, soft magic systems like The Lord of the Rings are soft and irrational, and there's nothing wrong with that. Again, they're not used to solve problems, so you don't really need to know how they work. And you don't. You have no idea what Gandalf's powers are, and you have no way of guessing what future forms of magic you're going to see in the book. The first time I read Lord of the Rings, or watched the movies, I should say, because I watched the movies first, like a lot of people nowadays, I was floored when you get to the Return of the King and suddenly Aragorn has these powers to control the dead because they went back on a pact with his ancestor. It's just, it works. But I was so surprised because there's no hint that there is this kind of magic in the world until you get to that. And then there is. And like he kind of explains it, and so it's fine. But I was like, what? I had no idea, and you don't really get the full rules for that. But you understand the consequences, and so it's okay. But that's a perfect example, that's completely unrelated to any form of magic we had seen before or see afterwards. And you don't know how any of it works. Now on the flip side, there is one last quad for the soft, rational magic system. And this is the one that I think it's the hardest to fill. Because inherent to a soft magic system is that you don't really know the rules. And inherent to a rational magic system is that you can make a logical jump as to what is going to happen next or how the magic works based on what you already know. Those things seem to naturally be at odds. I have read on a couple of blog posts in my perusing days that there are certain books that fall into this, and this is typically books that are soft, but they feel like there's a rational logic to the magic behind them. The closest book that I have ever read to this is Jenna Marcy's The Savior's Champion, in that we don't know how the Savior's magic works. She doesn't really give us those answers, but there is a sense that Jenna herself does know this. And maybe I'm extrapolating that because I'm in her Discord server and she talks about how the magic works. And I think that it's going to be a much more rational and harder magic system in the next book because of that. But I don't know if that's pushing the envelope because I have that sort of like inside knowledge or what. But typically if you read a book where the magic system is not well defined, but you kind of have a feeling that the author is sticking to their own sense of rules, that's probably where you'd put soft rational, but they do tend to inherently clash, and so there's not a ton of books that fit this realm. Those are the 4 points. Those are the 2 axes on which magic systems can fall: hard versus soft, and rational or irrational. I'm gonna make my 4th video in the series and the last video on how to actually make one of these magic systems yourself. That'll come out probably sometime next week. I'm just sort of polishing up the script on how you go about making them. It's a pretty in-depth process in my opinion, and this is a video on how to make rational hard magic systems because that is what I'm doing right now for my next series. Because TPL is a 50-50 irrational magic system, so it doesn't really apply, but I am making a whole video on how I am making my hard rational magic system if that is something you want to make too. But until then, leave a comment in the comment section down below about where, if you are magic system making, world building, which I assume you are if you're watching these videos, where does your magic system fall on this spectrum? Rational, irrational, hard, soft, or a weird combination middle ground? Tell me about it in the comments down below. Subscribe, leave a comment if this video / series has been at all helpful, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!